The year was 1941, and America was staring into the abyss. Across the Atlantic, Hitler's panzer divisions were crushing everything in their path. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces were preparing for expansion that would soon bring war to American soil. And in a cramped office in Washington, D.C., a group of army generals were looking at each other with the kind of desperation that comes when you realize you're about to send boys into battle without the tools they need to survive. They needed a vehicle, not just any vehicle, but something that could do everything, go anywhere, survive anything. A reconnaissance car that could race across desert sand, a weapons platform that could mount a machine gun, an ambulance that could navigate jungle mud, a supply truck that could climb mountain passes, and they needed it yesterday. The specifications they wrote down that summer day seemed like fantasy. A quarter-ton vehicle that could carry 3 times its weight, ground clearance high enough to ford streams, 4-wheel drive, 4. Impossible terrain, simple enough that any farm boy could fix it with a wrench and some wire. And here was the impossible part. They needed it designed, tested, and in production in just 75 days. 75 days. The automobile industry veterans laughed. Ford, the giant of American manufacturing, took a look at those specs and said, maybe 2 years. Maybe. Other companies didn't even bother to bid. It was suicide. It was impossible. It was madness. But there was this small company in Toledo, Ohio. Willys. They'd been making cars since 1908, but by 1941 they were struggling, barely hanging on through the Depression years. They looked at those specifications, and they looked at their empty factory floors, and they said yes. Yes, we can do it. Because what choice did they have? Take the impossible contract, or close the doors forever. The chief engineer was a man named Delmar Roos. Brilliant, obsessive, the kind of engineer who dreamed in blueprints. He assembled a team, and they worked around the clock, sleeping on cots in the design room, living on coffee and determination. They stripped away everything that wasn't essential. No creature comforts, no styling, no chrome. Just raw function. Every pound mattered. Every inch counted. They were designing something that had never existed before. Vehicle that could literally do everything. In 49 days, not 75, they had a prototype. The army took one look at it, and their jaws dropped. It was ugly as sin, a flat nose, exposed engine, seats that were barely padded, a windshield that folded down, flat. It looked like someone had assembled a vehicle from spare parts in their garage, but then they drove it. Through mud that swallowed other vehicles, over rocks that would shatter ordinary axles, up hills that made seasoned drivers nervous. The little vehicle just kept going. They called it the Willys Quad. The soldiers who tested it called it something else. They called it a Jeep. Maybe from the GP designation for general purpose. Maybe from a Popeye cartoon. Character, nobody knows for sure. But the name stuck. The army was impressed, more than impressed. They were stunned. This ugly little vehicle could actually do what they needed. But now came the truly impossible part. The design was one thing. Building them was another. The army didn't need dozens of these Jeeps. They didn't need hundreds. They needed hundreds of thousands. They needed them flooding off production lines, like water from a broken dam. And they needed them now, because the storm was coming. This is where Charles Sorensen enters our story. You've probably never heard his name. History books don't spend much time on factory foremen. But Charles Sorensen was about to change the course of the war. And he was about to do it with an idea that everyone said was absolutely crazy. Sorensen was 52 years old in 1941. He'd spent his entire adult life on factory floors, working his way up from laborer to foreman at Willys-Overland. He wasn't educated. He didn't have engineering degrees. What he had was something more valuable. He understood how things were actually built. He understood the reality of metal and men and machinery. He'd watched assembly lines for 30 years, and he'd seen every mistake, every bottleneck, every wasted motion that slowed production to a crawl. The traditional way to build a vehicle took days. You'd start with a frame on a static station. A team of workers would gather around it. They'd bolt on the axles, the suspension, the engine. Piece by piece, the vehicle would take shape. When that station was done, they'd push the partially completed vehicle to the next station, where another team would add more parts. It was slow. It was inefficient. But it was how everyone did. It was how Ford did it. It was how every automobile manufacturer in America did it. Sorensen looked at the Jeep specifications, and he looked at the demand the Army wanted 5,000 Jeeps a month too. Start, then ramping up to 15,000, then more, and he knew the traditional method would never work. Never. You could hire every worker in Toledo and run 3 shifts, and you still couldn't build Jeeps fast enough. The mathematics didn't work. The war would be over, won or lost, before they built enough Jeeps to matter. He started sketching, late at night, in his small house on the edge of Toledo, by lamplight. He drew diagrams that his wife thought were the doodlings of a man losing his mind. He was redesigning the entire concept of assembly, not just improving it, fundamentally, reimagining it from the ground up. Henry Ford had pioneered the moving assembly line, back in 1913, for the Model T, revolutionary for its time. But Ford's system still had limitations. It moved the vehicle past stationary workers, yes, but it moved it slowly, and workers still gathered around each station. Sorensen saw something different. He saw synchronization. He saw rhythm. He saw a production line that moved like music, where every worker did exactly one task, where every part arrived at exactly the right moment, where the vehicle flowed through the factory like water through a pipe. He called it progressive assembly. The engineers called it insane. You can't build something as complex as a vehicle that way, they said. Too many parts, too much precision required, too many things that can go wrong. And besides, workers aren't machines. They get tired. They make mistakes. They can't maintain that kind of precision and speed for hours on end. Sorensen listened to all the reasons why it couldn't work. Then he went to the factory floor and started building the line anyway. He began with time studies, not the kind that management does with stopwatches to squeeze more work from exhausted laborers, something different. He broke down the construction of a Jeep into individual tasks. Installing 4 bolts on a wheel, assembly, attaching a fuel line, mounting a carburetor, hundreds of separate tasks. And for each task, he measured not just how long it took, but how long it should take if everything was perfectly organized. If the parts were positioned exactly right. If the worker didn't have to reach, didn't have to walk, didn't have to search. Then he designed stations around those tasks. Each station would perform one specific job, and only that job. The worker wouldn't move. The Jeep would move. It would roll up on a conveyor, stop for exactly the time needed to complete that one task, then move on. The next Jeep would arrive. The worker would perform the same task again, and again. And again. The engineers hated it. This was dehumanizing, they said. Workers would revolt. The union would strike. You're turning skilled craftsmen into robots. Sorensen's response was simple. We're not building art, we're building weapons. Speed is the skill that matters now. Precision is the craft. And if we don't figure this out, those boys shipping overseas are going to die, because they don't have transportation. He built a prototype line in one corner of the factory, 50 feet long, 6 stations. He handpicked workers and trained them personally. Not just how to do their task, but why it mattered. This bolt you're installing, he'd say, it holds the steering mechanism. If it's loose, a driver loses control on a mountain road. If it's too tight, the threads strip and it fails. Your job isn't just important. Your job is life or death. The first test was a disaster. Parts arrived at the wrong times. Stations backed up. The conveyor moved too fast, then too slow. Workers fumbled with tools. Bolts got cross-threaded. It was chaos. The engineers nodded knowingly. See, impossible. Sorensen just adjusted and tried again. He spent weeks on that 50-foot line, adjusting the conveyor speed, repositioning parts bins, changing the order of operations, training workers until the motions became muscle memory. And slowly, incredibly, it started to work. The rhythm emerged. Station 1, Station 2, Station 3, flowing like a dance. When he finally had it running smoothly, he timed it. A complete jeep rolling off that small line. Every 15 minutes. The factory managers were impressed but skeptical. 15 minutes was good, they admitted, but you did it with your best. Workers on a tiny line with perfect conditions. Scale it up to the whole factory, with regular workers, with real-world chaos, and it'll fall apart. You'll be lucky to maintain 1 jeep per hour. Sorensen didn't argue. He just started building more lines. He divided the factory floor into parallel assembly streams. Parts came in one end, flowing from suppliers he'd personally vetted and trained. The components were pre-sorted, pre-positioned, delivered to each station in the exact sequence needed. The conveyor system grew more sophisticated, the timing more precise. He implemented what he called progressive specialization. Workers didn't just learn one job, they learned several jobs at adjacent stations. If someone got sick or tired, another worker could slide over and cover. The line kept moving, always moving. And as workers became expert at their tasks, as the muscle memory locked in, as the rhythm became instinctive, something remarkable happened. The speed increased. By early 1942, with America now fully at war. After Pearl Harbor, Sorensen's lines were producing 1 complete jeep every 5 minutes. The army officers who toured the factory couldn't believe it. 5 minutes for an entire vehicle. They'd walk the line, watching workers bolt, weld, and assemble, watching bare frames enter one end and complete jeeps drive off the other, and they'd shake their heads in wonder. But Sorensen wasn't satisfied. 5 minutes was good, but the demand was growing. The army needed jeeps in North Africa, where Rommel's Afrika Korps was, threatening Egypt. They needed jeeps in the Pacific, where island fighting required vehicles that could handle beach, sand, and jungle trails. They needed jeeps in England, where the build-up for the eventual invasion of Europe was beginning. They needed more, always more. Sorensen pushed harder. He refined the process. He discovered that certain tasks could be parallelized, done simultaneously on different parts of the vehicle. He implemented subassembly lines that fed into the main line. Engines were fully assembled on one line, transmissions on another, electrical systems on a third. These complete subsystems would arrive at the main line at exactly the moment they were needed, lifting into place with precision. He became obsessed with waste. Not just waste of materials, but waste of motion. Waste of time, if a worker had to reach 6 inches farther than necessary. That was waste. If parts arrived in boxes that had to be opened, that was waste. If a tool wasn't positioned exactly right, that was waste. He eliminated waste everywhere, shaving seconds from every operation. The workers who'd initially resented the system began to take pride in it. They could see the results. Every day, more jeeps rolled off the line. Every day, the news brought reports of American forces advancing somewhere, and they knew their jeeps were part of that advance. They weren't just building vehicles, they were building victory. By mid-1942, the line was producing 1 jeep every 2 minutes. But that still wasn't enough. The invasion of North Africa was planned. For November, Operation Torch. Tens of thousands of American troops would land on hostile beaches, and they'd need mobile firepower immediately. The army came to Willys-Overland with desperation in their eyes. "We need a surge," they said. "We need everything you can possibly give us." Sorensen looked at his production lines, and he did something that made the factory owners think he'd finally lost his mind. He added a 3rd shift, not unusual. Lots of factories ran 3 shifts, but he didn't just add workers to the existing lines. He trained the 3rd shift on a completely new method he'd been developing. in secret. He called it synchronized parallel assembly. Instead of one main line with sub-assembly feeds, he created multiple complete assembly lines running simultaneously, perfectly timed, so that they shared certain resources: paint, booths, testing stations, final inspection, but otherwise operated independently. If one line had a problem, the others kept running, and the workers weren't assigned to just one line. They rotated, trained on every position, so that the factory became this living organism where knowledge flowed and adaptation was instant. The result was staggering. By October 1942, just weeks before Operation Torch, the Willys-Overland factory in Toledo was producing one complete Jeep every 90 seconds. 90 seconds. Let that sink in. From bare frame to fully functional, tested, ready-to-ship military vehicle in the time it takes to boil water for tea. The generals who toured the factory stood and watched the line in stunned silence. Jeeps, rolling off like clockwork, each one perfect, each one tested, each one immediately loaded onto trains bound for ports where they'd be shipped across the Atlantic. The numbers became almost absurd. In November 1942 alone, Willys-Overland produced over 20,000 Jeeps. 20,000. The factory ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers rotated through shifts, but the line never stopped. It just kept producing this incredible machine of American industrial might. And then those Jeeps went to war, and the reports started coming back. Soldiers wrote letters home about their Jeeps. Officers filed reports. War correspondents wrote stories, and they all said the same thing: the Jeep was the most useful piece of equipment in the entire army. Ernie Pyle, the famous war correspondent, called it faithful as a dog, strong as a mule, and agile as a goat. General George Marshall said the Jeep, the Dakota transport plane, and the landing craft were the three tools that won the war. General Eisenhower was more direct. He said America's greatest contribution to modern warfare was the Jeep. They mounted 50 caliber machine guns on them and used them for mobile firepower. They welded armor plates on them and used them for reconnaissance into enemy territory. They fitted them with stretchers and used them as ambulances, racing wounded soldiers from front lines to field hospitals. They loaded them with radio equipment and used them as mobile command posts. They equipped them with wire cutters and used them to breach defensive obstacles. In the Pacific, they waterproofed them and drove them off landing craft directly into beach assaults. There's a famous photograph from the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. American troops are advancing up a dusty road, and right in the middle of the column is a Jeep, and on that Jeep is a soldier manning a machine gun, and behind him are cases of ammunition, and tied to the back are jerry cans of fuel and water, and strapped to the hood is a stretcher. One vehicle serving 4 different purposes simultaneously. That was the genius of the Jeep. It adapted to whatever the soldiers needed, but the Jeep could only be useful if there were enough of them, and that's where Sorensen's revolution mattered. By 1943, the Willys-Overland factory wasn't the only one building Jeeps. Ford had been brought in to help meet demand, and they'd adopted Sorensen's methods. Together, the two factories were producing Jeeps at a rate that seemed impossible. Over 600,000 Jeeps were built during the war years. 600,000. Think about what that meant logistically. Every Jeep required thousands of parts from hundreds of suppliers. Tires from rubber plants. Steel from mills. Glass for windshields. Fabric for seats. Electrical components. Engine parts. Each supplier had to maintain the same relentless pace, the same quality standards. Sorensen's revolution wasn't just in Toledo. It rippled through the entire American industrial system, forcing suppliers to innovate, to speed up, to improve quality control. The Jeep became a driver of manufacturing, efficiency across dozens of industries, and the workers who built them became legendary. There are stories, probably apocryphal, but they capture the spirit of workers who could assemble entire sections, blindfolded, because the motions had become so instinctive. Of maintenance crews who could swap out a broken conveyor motor in under 5 minutes because every second of downtime was a Jeep not built. Of quality inspectors who could spot a misaligned bolt from 10 feet away, just by the way light reflected off it. The factory became a point of pride for Toledo. Families would gather at the fence on weekends just to watch the finished Jeeps roll out an endless stream of olive drab vehicles loading onto trains. Workers wore their Willys-Overland badges around town with the same pride that soldiers wore their uniforms. Children played games, pretending to be assembly line workers, mimicking the motions they'd seen there. Parents practice at home. But it wasn't perfect. The pace was brutal. 90 seconds per Jeep meant that workers were in constant motion for entire shifts. Repetitive stress injuries became common. The factory hospital treated hundreds of cases of tendinitis, back strain, hand injuries. Some workers couldn't maintain the pace and had to be transferred to slower positions. The turnover rate was significant, with new workers constantly being trained to replace those who couldn't handle the physical demands. Sorensen was aware of this cost. He implemented mandatory breaks, rotation schedules to vary the physical demands, ergonomic improvements to reduce strain, but there was only so much he could do. The war demanded speed, and speed demanded sacrifice. The workers understood this. They'd read the newspapers. They knew what was at stake. They had sons and brothers, and husbands overseas who needed those Jeeps. In June 1944, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. On D-Day alone, thousands of Jeeps landed. On those beaches, there's footage, grainy, black and white film, of Jeeps driving off. Landing craft into the surf, water up to their headlights, engines sputtering but running, climbing up the beach under fire, racing inland to support the advancing troops. Some of those Jeeps were destroyed in the first minutes of the invasion, blown apart by artillery or riddled with machine gun fire. But more kept coming, always more, because back in Toledo, the line kept running. 90 seconds, another Jeep. 90 seconds, another Jeep. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 was Hitler's last desperate offensive in the West. German forces smashed through American lines in the Ardennes forest, creating chaos and confusion. But the American forces had mobility that the Germans couldn't match. Jeeps raced through snow and ice carrying ammunition, 2 surrounded units evacuating wounded, repositioning machine guns, maintaining communication, the ability to respond quickly, to adapt to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. That mobility was crucial to blunting the German advance. And that mobility came from Toledo. By the time the war ended in August 1945, the Willys-Overland factory had produced over 360,000 Jeeps. Ford had built another 277,000. Together, over 640,000 Jeeps had been delivered to the war effort. They'd served on every front, in every theater, in every conceivable condition. Desert heat that reached 130 degrees, Arctic cold that froze, fuel lines, tropical humidity that rusted, metal overnight, mountain altitudes that starved engines of oxygen. The Jeep survived it all. And here's something remarkable: the design barely changed during the entire war. In an era when weapon systems were constantly being updated and improved, when fighter planes went through multiple versions in just months, the Jeep remained essentially the same from 1941 to 1945, because the original design was so good, so fundamentally right, that it didn't need improvement. Roos and his team had gotten it right the first time, but the production method, Sorensen's revolutionary assembly process, that did change. It evolved and improved constantly. By the end of the war, the factory was producing 1 Jeep every 80 seconds. They'd shaved another 10 seconds off the process. 10 seconds doesn't sound like much, but over a full day of production, that 10 seconds meant dozens more Jeeps. Over a year, thousands more. After the war ended, Sorensen retired. He was 64 years old and exhausted. He'd spent 4 years working essentially non-stop, rarely taking days off, always at the factory, always pushing, always refining. He'd accomplished something extraordinary. But the toll had been immense. He died in 1952, just 7 years after the war ended. His obituary in the Toledo paper was small, barely noticeable. It mentioned his long career at Willys-Overland, but didn't go into detail about what he'd achieved. History, it seemed, had already forgotten him, but his legacy lived on in ways he couldn't have imagined. The manufacturing techniques he pioneered, progressive assembly, synchronized parallel production, continuous improvement, waste elimination, became standard practice across American industry. After the war, those techniques were applied to consumer goods, appliances, electronics, automobiles, all built using principles that Sorensen had developed under the pressure of wartime production. The Japanese, rebuilding their shattered industrial base after the war, studied American manufacturing methods. Intensely, they looked at what had made American war production so effective. They learned about the Jeep and the Liberty ships and the aircraft production programs, and they took those lessons and refined them even further, developing what would become known as the Toyota production system, the foundation of modern lean manufacturing. The DNA of Sorensen's wartime innovations runs through every modern assembly line in the world. The Jeep itself became an icon. After the war, Willys-Overland started producing civilian versions. Farmers bought them, ranchers, rural mail carriers, anyone who needed a tough, reliable vehicle that could handle rough terrain. The design evolved slowly, more comfortable seats, an enclosed cab option, improved engines, but the basic concept remained, and it spawned an entire category of vehicles. The Jeep brand became synonymous with capability and durability. Today, there are vintage Jeeps still running, still used by collectors and enthusiasts. These vehicles are over 80 years old, and they still work. You can find them at military vehicle shows, carefully restored to their wartime configuration. And when you look at one up close, when you touch the steel that was shaped in Toledo in 1943, when you sit in the driver's seat and grip the steering wheel, you're touching history in the most tangible way possible. But more than that, you're experiencing the result of one man's refusal to accept the word impossible. Charles Sorensen wasn't a general or a politician or a famous inventor. He was a factory foreman who looked at an impossible problem and decided that maybe impossible just meant nobody had figured out how yet. He took the collective wisdom of the entire automobile industry, all the experts who said it couldn't be done, and he ignored them. He trusted his own eyes, his own experience, his own understanding of how things actually worked on a factory floor. And he changed the war. Not with a weapon, not with a strategy, not with a brilliant battle plan. He changed it with efficiency, with speed, with the relentless application of simple principles: eliminate waste, synchronize operations, empower workers, never stop improving. Boring principles, maybe. Unglamorous, but they mattered. They mattered enormously. There's a memorial in Toledo now, outside the old Willys-Overland factory building. The factory itself closed decades ago, the building converted to other uses, but there's a small park with a restored wartime Jeep on a pedestal. And there's a plaque that lists the production numbers. Over 360,000 Jeeps built right here in Toledo. But most people who walk past that memorial don't know the story. They don't know about Charles Sorensen and his crazy idea. They don't know about the 90-second production cycle that generals said was impossible. They don't know about the workers who stood at those assembly stations for 4 years, building the vehicle that would help win the war. History remembers the generals and the battles and the grand strategies. It remembers D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge and the bombing of Hiroshima. It remembers Roosevelt and Churchill and Eisenhower. But it forgets the factory foreman in Toledo who figured out how to build a Jeep. In 90 seconds, it forgets the workers who stood at those stations, bolt after bolt, weld after weld, jeep after jeep, for 4 long years, but they were there. They did that, and it mattered. When you think about World War II, when you imagine what victory required, don't just think about the soldiers on the beaches, or the pilots in the air. Think about the factory floors. Think about the ordinary people who took impossible demands and made them reality, through sheer determination and innovation. Think about Charles Sorensen, 52 years old, in 1941, looking at specifications that called for production levels nobody had ever achieved, and instead of saying it couldn't be done, asking himself how it could be done. That's the real story of the war. Not just the battles, but the logistics. Not just the heroes, but the workers. Not just the weapons, but the manufacturing genius that produced them. The Jeep won the war, not because it was a brilliant weapon. It wasn't even a weapon. It won because there were enough of them, everywhere they were. Needed. Always available. Never running out. And that happened because one man refused to accept limitations. The war ended 78. 9 years ago now. The generation that fought it is mostly gone. The generation that built the weapons and vehicles is entirely gone. The factories are quiet, or demolished, or converted. The assembly lines are silent. But the principle remains. When someone tells you something is impossible, when all the experts agree it can't be done, when the timeline is absurd and the specifications are fantasy and the smart, money says to walk away. Remember Charles Sorensen. Remember that impossible is often just a failure of imagination. Remember that sometimes the solution comes not from the experts, but from the person who actually has to do the work. 90 seconds, that's how long it took to build a Jeep in Toledo in 1944. 90 seconds from bare frame to complete vehicle. The generals wanted days. The experts said hours would be optimistic. Sorensen delivered 90 seconds. And in doing so, he helped win the war. That's the story that should be remembered. That's the lesson that shouldn't be forgotten. Not that we won the war, or everyone knows that, but how we won it with innovation and determination and the refusal to accept limitations. With ordinary people doing extraordinary things, with factory foremen who changed the world 90 seconds at a time.